Honourable Senators, I see that we have quorum. I call this meeting of the Standing Committee on Transport and Communications to order. I am Julie Miville-Deschênes, Senator from Quebec, and Deputy Chair of this community. This evening, I am holding the chair in the absence of Senator Houssakas.
Colleagues to introduce themselves, starting on my left.
Hello, I'm Senator Paula Simons. I come from Alberta and from Treaty 6 territory.
Senator Darrell Friedhandler from Alberta.
Bernadette Clément, Ontario.
Senator Donna Dasco from Ontario.
Merci, chers collègues.
Thank you, kind colleagues. This evening, we continue our study of the local and regional services provided by CBC Radio-Canada. Joining us by video conference this evening, the committee welcomes April Lindgren
At Toronto Metropolitan University, Marla Boltman, Executive Director, and Sarah Andrews, Director of Government and Media Relations from Friend of Canadian Media, and Derek Gray, Chief Research and Operation Officer at Numerous. Welcome and thank you for joining us. We will first hear opening remarks of 5 minutes each, starting with Professor Lindgren, followed by Ms. Boltman, and then Mr. Gray. Their opening remarks will then be followed by question and answer. Professor Lindgren, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to the committee for inviting me here today. I run something called the Local News Research Project at Toronto Metropolitan University School of Journalism in Toronto. That's formerly Ryerson. One of the project's initiatives is the Local News Map, which is an online resource that tracks where and when...
Miss Lindgren, we will try to put the sound up a little bit. It's a bit low. Can you just repeat your name, maybe?
Sure. April Lindgren. Is that working better?
That's much better, much better. Okay, so please, we know who you are. Let's start.
Okay, do you want me to start from the beginning, or?
We know your name. Just start with the content of your presentation.
Okay, sure. So one of the project's initiatives, I run something called the Local News Research Project, and one of its initiatives...
No, it's not working. Oh, yes. The mic, could you play a little bit with your mic there? Put it, a bit closer to your mouth. That's where it was.
How's that? Is that better?
I think so.
Hello?
Yes, let's do another test. Sorry.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Okay, let's go.
Okay, great. So I run something called the Local News Research Project at Toronto Metropolitan University School of Journalism. And one of our initiatives is something called the Local News Map. It's an online resource that tracks where and when a print, a broadcast, or an online local news outlet closes, when one launches, if their service increases or service decreases. We have data that goes back to 2008, and I'm going to draw upon that data today to make the point that there's a significant role, I think, for the CBC in meeting the information needs of local communities at a time when many people have less and less access to local news. For the purposes of our project, the definition of a local news outlet is one that maintains independence from its sources, from the people it covers, demonstrates a commitment to accuracy and transparency in reporting methods, and is devoted primarily to reporting and disseminating timely, originally produced news about people, places, issues, and events in a defined geographic area. So we produce a summary report of the local news map every 2 months, and I did share a copy with the committee in advance, although I'm not sure if you have it yet. The latest data shows that 521 local news outlets have closed in 347 communities across Canada since 2008. Now, 3/4 of those were community newspapers that publish fewer than 5 times a week. But in the last 18 months or so, broadcast news is also taking a hit. So we've had CBC and Global canceling local newscasts and shutting down radio stations. When I checked recently, 37 local radio stations have closed since 2008, but fully a third, about 11 of them, have happened in just the last 18 months, to that earlier point I was making. Now, of course, local news outlets have also opened since 2008, but only at about half as many have opened as have closed. So there's been a net loss. In the spring, we did a deeper dive into what's now 15 years of data from this map. And I think the results demonstrate the need for a public broadcaster to play an even larger role going forward in filling the local news voids caused by the retreat of commercial media. So between 2008 and April, which is when we looked at the data, nearly half of all the closings occurred in places with fewer than 20,000 people. By comparison, only about 75 launched in these small communities. So I think there's a case to be made that a public broadcaster has a role to play in ensuring these smaller places have access to news and information, just like people who live in more populous locations. Since 2014, the closings have also increasingly been concentrated in lower income places, where arguably people have less capacity to pay for local news, and they need a free source like the CBC. Between 2019 and 2024, for instance, about 2/3 of all the closings happened in places with that had less than the national median income. Now, of course, news outlets start up and they close over time in communities. So we wanted to see if there are any actual winners over time, and we didn't find very many. However, overall, we found that in 239 communities, the number of closings by far exceeded the number of launches. So in other words, people have access to fewer sources of local news. By comparison, only 76 have emerged, by which I mean the number of new arrivals over time in these communities have been greater than the number of closings. So a question I often get asked is whether the new independent, mostly digital local news media arriving on the scene can pick up the slack. They are certainly important and they often produce good journalism, but they remain relatively small and limited in number. And I can elaborate on that later if you would like. I'll just wrap up by saying Canadians are aware there is a problem. Data recently gathered for a McGill University study shows that only about half of people in cities and towns are somewhat satisfied with local news coverage. That satisfaction level drops to 40% among rural residents. So my time is up, and I'll just conclude by saying that at a time when the private sector media is in many communities is not able to provide people with the news and information required to navigate daily life, I think the public broadcaster, particularly CBC Online and CBC Radio, has an increasingly important role to play in ensuring that those needs are addressed.
Thank you very much for all this data, Ms. Lindgren. So now the floor is to Ms. Marla Bolton with Ms. Sarah Andrews, and you both have 5 minutes that you can divide as you want.
Good evening. Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me all right? Great. Okay. And thank you, Senators, for inviting us to appear this evening. Again, my name is Marla Boltman. I'm the Executive Director of Friends of Canadian Media. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan citizens movement that stands up for Canadian voices in Canadian media. We work to protect and defend Canada's rich cultural sovereignty and the healthy democracy it sustains. Joining me again is Sarah Andrews, our Director of Government and Media Relations, who will conclude our opening remarks en français. But together, in English and in French, we are here with a simple, unmistakable message. Local news has never been more needed and yet never more at risk. It is virtually impossible to place a value on the importance of local news, that which is credible, verifiable, and subjected to rigorous editorial oversight. Local news connects us in our communities and between our communities. It keeps us informed and less vulnerable to those who seek to disinform. In so doing, it helps keep us together. Local news also serves as a check on authority by challenging those in positions of power, creating accountability, and combating corruption. As parliamentarians in our upper house, who, in your own right, serve a challenge function, I am sure you will agree strongly with this important duty. It is for all of these reasons that we say quite seriously that our democratic health very much relies upon the well-being of local news. But sadly, as you know, it is in crisis. Cutbacks combined with inconsistent attempts to recreate the financial and distribution models that online technologies have disrupted have left local news organizations struggling. Occasionally, we will see an internet startup plug some gaps by providing bulletins and information or unedited, unverified opinion. But this is no substitute. Such ventures lack the scale, the heft, and the trust required to contribute a fraction of what is being lost.
Nous avons vu des médias privés
We have seen private media sell off radio stations and centralized television broadcasting. We've seen dozens of daily and weekly newspapers bought up and closed down. It's no exaggeration to say that when it comes to local media, much as national media, we're witnessing a flagrant market failure. That's what makes CBC Radio-Canada so vital. It can use to serve the entire country. CBC Radio-Canada is a source of local news gathering and reporting that almost everyone relies on. In Quebec, in the north, in rural communities, and elsewhere, it's CBC Radio-Canada that people turn to for information and news. Despite this, some want our national public broadcaster to be terminated. The damage such actions could do to our communities, to our ability to counter misinformation and disinformation, and to our democratic health are almost impossible to fathom. To conclude, we do have a few recommendations for your committee. First, greater support must be given to the creation and broadcasting of local news by ensuring that they're adequately funded. Second, we must ensure that local news are properly prioritized through an updated mandate for CBC Radio-Canada. Finally, we must not ignore what the polls keep telling us Canadians want and need an improved CBC Radio-Canada. Thank you. We'll be happy to answer your questions.
Merci, mesdames.
Thank you, ladies. Thank you for being so concise. Much appreciated.
Mr. Derek Gray, speak for 5 minutes.
Hi, thank you, Ms. Chair, and good evening to the senators. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Dr. Derek Gray. I'm the Chief Research and Operating Officer for Numeris, and Numeris is the not-for-profit joint industry committee responsible for video and audio audience estimates to support the Canadian media industry. I've been asked to look at the performance of CBC as well as SLC over the past 10 years in comparison to some of the other channels, the for-profit channels or privately owned channels. Looking at the data in the case of television, I'll start with television, then I'll go on to radio. In the case of television, we do see that all TV networks have been showing downward trends in audiences over the past 10 years. CBC itself, the CBC network, does tend to have a steeper decline in their audiences than the other privately owned networks, with the exception for Western Canada. So that's Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC, where we do see two large privately owned networks that are showing a much steeper decline in audiences than the CBC. If we look at SRC, we see it as relatively flat in most regions in terms of their audience. However, Quebec, where the bulk of their viewership comes from, they do have a decline there. However, their decline is less than some of the other French privately owned networks. This pattern tends to hold true for individuals 2+, adults 18 years of age and older, as well as adults 25 to 54 years old. And we do see that the decline is driven by what is known as reach. That is the number of unique individuals that are tuning into CBC or SRC, as opposed to the time spent. So less people are watching. However, those that are watching tend to be watching for more similar amounts of time as before. Radio is a slightly different story. Again, there is downward pressure on Canadian radio. Most radio stations do show a downward trend in audiences. However, the CBC and SRC radio stations have been relatively flat in terms of audiences over the past 10 years. Their long-term trend ranges anywhere from being up by about 1% to below by 1%, and that's within, relative errors there. So it's fairly flat. Whereas the commercial radio stations do tend to show a downward trend. We see this consistent across the 6 measured metros. So that's French Montreal, English Montreal, Toronto, Calgary, Edmonton, and Vancouver. And this pattern is quite consistent again for individuals 2 years of age or older, adults 18+, and adults 25-54. In the case of CBC and SRC radio, both reach and time spent do show similar patterns and are relatively flat over the past 10 years. That would conclude what my data is saying. Wow.
Thank you very much. Before I will ask a question to start with. Yes, I can do that. So, Madame Andrews, je voulais vous...
Ms. Andrews, I have a question for you about CBC Radio-Canada. You have told us, at least you mentioned the mandate. We have received other witnesses before, and the CRTC has said, as we know, that CBC Radio-Canada's mandate does not oblige it to ensure regional presence by number of stations, just by CBC's capacity. So that's quite vague. So would you like something more specific, that something more specific be required? Right now, CBC Radio-Canada can choose where it wants to invest. It's an independent state diffuser. And would you like something less independent? Would you like spending to be more directed? I will try to answer your first question about the mandate because I think it is an important topic to address. I think what you've heard in prior meetings of the committee is that there are many options with regard to licensing. The current mandate, which is in the Broadcasting Act, speaks of regions, not the number of locations. But in licensing, it's based on location. CBC Radio-Canada must provide new local services. So our issue is that under the current conditions, there are no floors, no minimums for CBC Radio-Canada spending on new outlets. This is something that CBC Radio-Canada has tried to address in recent licensing, and it's something that we have asked the Cabinet to address in CBC Radio-Canada regulations. But as you see, CBC Radio-Canada hasn't yet addressed this issue, and under its current license, it has another year to do so. So that would be the first step, we think, set a minimum expenditure for local news. CBC Radio-Canada's argument is that it has always respected its requirements, but that doesn't mean there shouldn't be a minimum. As for the mandate, that's a broader issue. It's quite vague, as you have said, at present, and covers entertainment, informing Canadians. It would be an important discussion to have, an interesting one. We have called on our backers over the last year to ask them what they expect from CBC Radio-Canada. Local news is often brought up. Local news counts for Canadians. We've heard a good deal about original productions, Canadian stories, our stories. That too counts for them. And radio is also important for those who support us. Senator Simons. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Gray, I have to tell you, as somebody who spent 6 years as a CBC radio producer in Edmonton and in Toronto, your numbers cheer me greatly, because I then went on to work in newspapers, and I know, as Ms. Lindgren says, there's been a precipitous decline in every kind of media, conventional media in this country. So the fact that CBC Radio is holding firm, or perhaps even slightly going up, suggests that they're doing better than almost anybody else, doesn't it?
So in all fairness, I've looked at CBC as a single entity, all the CBC radio stations combined, and the privately owned as a single entity. So that is an average. I'm comparing two averages there. Particular stations, there may be privately owned radio stations that are doing better than CBC, but as a group, they are showing a decline, and you're absolutely right. CBC does tend to be holding stable and flat over the 10 years.
Radio as opposed to television.
Correct.
So that's really interesting. I guess the real question then is, Ms. Lindgren, Professor Lindgren, when you're looking at closures, you mentioned that there were some CBC closures. Can you tell us where those were?
Oh, no, actually, I didn't mention CBC closings. I said there'd been radio station closings, but they're private and community radio stations. So they're mostly private and community radio stations that have closed. 37, I think, since 2008, but 18 in the last little while.
Be able to tell us probably, although I'd love this information, how many communities are at this point almost wholly reliant on the CBC for their news?
Well, you know, this is one of the dilemmas we have in Canada, is that we really don't have a good sense of where the so-called news deserts are, which is places that have no news coverage, local news coverage at all. And we have no idea of how different communities are served and who's better served and who's more poorly served. So the answer is I don't know the answer to that. CBC probably could answer that question. But I do think that lack of information is a bit of a problem when we think about what the role of the broadcaster is, because obviously we want it to be in places where there's little or no other, if there are little or no other private sector options, it's increasingly important in those places. And I would just add, I think it's increasingly important in those places in an era when we have so much more unpredictable weather and emergencies and floods and fires. And, you know, radio remains a very important part of the notification and getting information to people in really difficult situations. You know, it's no coincidence that the emergency kits that people are recommended to have if there's a wildfire or floods coming is a crank radio.
So I have questions for everybody, but I'm going to go back to Mr. Gray for a minute. One of the challenges is that we're looking at television numbers, knowing that far fewer people are watching television in any way, not just watching the television news, they're not watching linear TV. You know, lots of people under 30 don't own a television set at all. But are you tracking at all downloads or, you know, clicks to CBC web pages or private radio web pages? Because that, I think, is how a lot of people consume their news, even if it's produced by what were conventional broadcasters who have pivoted to digital.
So we are tracking video. So the clicks on a web page would not be measured by us. However, going to streaming from, say, CBC Gem, either via connected TV or via smartphone, we would capture that. The currency that is used for trading right now, which is what I referred to in the data set I looked at, that is for linear television, because that is how ads are bought and sold in Canada right now. But we do have a service that's currently running that measures video in terms of streaming across pure plays, broadcaster video on demand, and so forth in Ontario and Quebec, and the media industry does have access to that data. Our hope is by summer, we should roll that out nationally, and then it's up to the industry at what point they want to transition to that as the currency. But as I said, websites, clicks to websites and banners, that is outside the scope of our measurement service. We are audio and video.
Presumably, I mean, I worked in broadcasting for years in private radio before the CBC. I mean, the reason the ratings mattered is because that was how you sold the ads.
Correct.
CBC, and this is a sore point with a lot of print publications, CBC sells ads on its websites. So does that have anything to do with your ratings, or is that based entirely on the information they generate and say to their advertisers, we're getting X many clicks because Google tells us?
So ads in terms of websites and print, that falls under Vividata, which is a different organization. So they'd be the individuals that would be measuring that for the purpose of print, digital print, and hard print trading.
Interesting. Thank you to all the witnesses.
Senator Dasko.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, thanks to everyone for being here. So, Mr. Gray, could you just describe the methodology that you use to measure viewing and listening? What technology are you using?
So we license the PPM meter from Nielsen, which is a portable people meter. It is a small device, looks very similar to a pager. We have individuals across about 5,000, or sorry, roughly 5,000 Canadian households. So that equates to about 11,000 individuals who carry this pager. Within the audio stream of radio stations, as well as the audio stream of TV stations, there is an inaudible watermark code that gets picked up by that meter. So when an individual carrying one of our meters is exposed to the radio station or the TV channel, the meter recognizes that watermark and it relays the information to us. From that point, we do estimation using statistical methods and produce the audience estimate.
Right, so
we do follow global guidelines. We have been audited by the Media Ratings Council in the U.S., and our methodology does stand up to global standards.
So you're asking individuals to carry a device, so you know
Correct.
that person X or person Y is the one who's consuming
Correct. Yes.
the particular media, right? So just in terms of what you've been finding, can you distinguish? You must be able to distinguish between different types of programming that people are or are not listening to, and whether those are going up and down. I think you were telling us about overall television steep decline, CBC, SRC less steep decline, flat. Radio is flat. Is this across all modes? Types of programming, or are we seeing steep declines in news consumption versus entertainment or music or other categories, special programming?
So unfortunately with radio, we don't measure content type. Radio is transacted on by time bands, day parts. So I could look at the data, the morning drive time, the afternoon drive time, and give you that. Television does. We do have content ratings in TV, so we could certainly look at content type. Of course, CBC carries sports, carries news, various things, and we could look at some of the trends for that. I would have to get back to the committee with that. I don't have the data with me right now.
Yes, because, we've got CBC, which, obviously is producing various kinds of programming, and it's really interesting and helpful to know what it is that is being consumed, and especially what's going up or down. Ms. Lindgren, I have a couple of questions. So you were giving numbers about outlets that have closed and the net loss of local news outlets. Do we know what people are doing who have lost those outlets? I mean, are they? I'm thinking about displacement. Have they found other sources for their news online or whatever it may be? Or maybe they're not. Maybe they actually are not even looking for other sources of news. And I know that when you're talking about outlets opening and closing, you're not actually talking about, the loss to particular individuals who might have been following a certain outlet, it's closed, and what are those people doing? I know it's a really hard thing to measure, but do you have any sense of that?
The only sense I have is anecdotal. I mean, first, just let me say that, if it's a relatively rich media environment locally, if one news outlet closes, ideally you would have access or the opportunity to go to other sources in your community for reliable local news. The challenge is that in addition to news outlets closing, a lot of surviving more traditional media are also really much reduced in terms of the amount of news that they're producing, and thus we get these conversations about ghost or zombie radio station newspapers in particular, where they continue to publish, but there may be like one or two stories in them. And the same thing happens with radio stations and television stations. Again, significant reductions in local content. So I've just been looking at Kingston, Ontario, for instance, where the Kingston Whig Standard, which is a Kingston Whig Standard, a storied newspaper, has been significantly reduced and to the point where there's fewer than half a dozen people in their newsroom. And then earlier this summer, the local global television station also was significantly cut. All the on-air people were let go. the newscast was cut to half an hour, and it's now the anchor is in Peterborough, and the lineup of the stories is decided in Toronto. So when I have been digging around in Kingston asking what people are doing, there is an online digital news source, thekingstonisst.com. So people are going there. But again, it's a small operation. It's 4 or 5 people, and compared to a newspaper like the Kingston Week Standard, which used to have upwards of 50 people. So I guess in a place where there are options, people will look for them. But news is also getting more difficult to discover. So you have to work a lot harder now to find local news than you used to because of the Meta ban, Facebook ban on local news as a result of the Online News Act, its reaction to the Online News Act. So it's not so obvious to people who used to just encounter news stories that were posted in their Facebook feed, and they could passively consume news that way because it came to them. That's happening less and well, it's not happening at all on Meta unless somebody puts up a screenshot, in which case you got to then go to the news site, and it requires much more effort. So I guess what I could say in answer to your question is people are having to work a lot harder to find alternatives to local news if it even exists. It's not a very good answer, but it's the best I can do.
Thank you very much. Senator Kuzner.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair. Thanks to the witnesses here. First, I guess, and Senator Simons and Fred Handler would be aware of the OK group, the OK radio group in Western Canada. And when I was leaving Fort McMurray in the late 80s, I used to do some work with CJOK and Kix 98. And they were at the sort of cusp of the digital radio station, and they didn't have anybody in over the weekend at all. Everything was done off online and what have you. I came back to Cape Breton, and we're a little bit slower to catch on in Cape Breton, I'll admit to that. Still very much analog, and but we had we had in our main radio station, we would have had 2 sports people and probably 4 or 5 in the news department, and then your on-air personalities, the DJs, what have you. That has since caught up to Fort McMurray, and they've been gutted. I think they have 1 news person at a time now. They take things offline. They whatever comes into the newsroom, they take it offline. But very, very little local news. Are we able to, you can track the number of stations that have closed down, the radio stations that have closed down? Are you able to track the shrinkage or the atrophy in the local newsrooms? The people that aren't getting out, a lot of the local stations now, nobody leaves the radio station. They count on community people. So is there any way of tracking that, or?
There. Yeah. Shall I answer that?
Yes.
There's no reliable tracking of that. I mean, we hear about it when there's a round of layoffs. We hear about it if somebody takes the time to focus and examine and study the local news environment in a particular community. Part of the problem is that, to be frank, news organizations aren't that keen to say to people, oh yeah, please continue to subscribe to my newspaper, or buy advertising on my station, and we've actually just cut the coverage from 5 people to 1, and we're going to give people less for their money. Or you're going to be reaching fewer people because there's going to be less content here that's going to be of interest, and fewer people are going to be drawn to what we're doing, or fewer people are going to be interested in there'll be fewer stories in the paper. So partly it's the media industry, newsrooms not that interested to admit that they've cut everything to the bone. And secondly, they're privately operated, so they don't have to. And third, nobody's actually tried it because of these difficulties. StatsCan data show that there hasn't been that big a change in the number of journalists in the country, but it also shows there's been a multiple times increase in the number of public relations people. And a lot of journalists, that's where they end up going. So I think there's no doubt that with fewer newsrooms, there are fewer journalists in communities keeping an eye on what politicians are doing, telling stories that introduce people to each other in the community, pointing to challenging issues and suggesting reporting on what solutions have been found in other places to help create conversations about ways forward. Sadly, we don't have any specific numbers that we can point to on this, except on a community by community, or actually even station or news outlet by news outlet case.
Mm-hmm. I guess for Dr. Gray, the sharp decline that you saw in CBC television, would that sort of be impacted by the loss of the Hockey Night in Canada broadcast? Because it would have been about 10 years ago they lost that contract, or?
So I don't have that data in front of me, but I would say that that's probably a very fair assumption that would play a role. But it wouldn't be the only driver in this case.
Okay. And then the one other one, do we have data, are we able to mine data that sort of, with CBC, are we able to separate the national programs from the local programs? I've got friends that, we've got 2 local on-air personalities in Cape Breton, and, they've got their audience, and I listen all weekend as well. Some people don't listen to the national programs, the debaters, and Because News and what have you. That makes my Saturday morning sort of a sad testament to my social life. But do we have that tracking as far as what breaks out with numbers locally versus nationally?
We do for television. We have that metadata for television that we can layer on. But again, with radio, radio's been sold on day parts primarily, so there is no content metadata, so we wouldn't be able to look at it that way for radio.
Thank you. Maybe this data that you have, the breakdown between national and local news at CBC Radio Canada, would be interesting for us if you could send that over.
Absolutely.
So this is now Senator Friedhandler turn to ask questions.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you, Chair.
And welcome to the committee.
Thank you. The questions I wanted to ask have kind of been touched upon. I think we've talked about who's actually operating at the local level, but I guess my fundamental question is, do viewers care? No matter what we mandate, no matter how many dollars we allocate, is anything going to change here? Or have we basically, with the public broadcaster, and particularly, I hear radio stable, so that's a good news story, but are we going to impact anything? Is there any evidence that money or mandating is going to change viewers' habits?
Maybe Ms. Boltman, would you
Hi, thank you.
To answer this?
I'd like to answer that, but I'd like to start in a different direction, which is we're talking a lot about statistics here, but we're not talking about the impacts on these communities and how they're feeling in terms of loss of news. And so 2 things I just want to say before I come back to your question is in the absence of local news, we have learned that 2 things are filling the vacuum. One is national news. And national news, as we know, is dominated by a handful of voices, and it tends to be more polarizing than local news, which explains in part why news avoidance numbers are spiking. So that also touches on your question. Have we lost people? Are they going to come back if they've been put off with news or they've gone other places? And when you combine that with social media's amplification of disinformation, we're left with an increasingly divided society with, low public trust in democratic institutions and processes. So that is sort of the impact of the loss. In terms of bringing them back, and do they care? I think they do. And if you'll indulge me for a moment here, we have reached out to many of our supporters over the years, and particularly most recently, about the CBC and their feelings on it, with the Minister of Heritage doing her study or putting her panel together to study the CBC. We asked people what they thought. And so I just want to share a couple quotes with you from our supporters.
Are those surveys? When you talk about your supporters, are there studies? What are you talking about?
So we have many things that we've done. In one case, we did a survey last November where we talked about trust in the news, and CBC actually was in English Canada rated first in terms of trustworthy and reliable news in English Canada, and it was rated second in French Canada. What I'm talking about here is sort of the way we communicate with our supporters. We ran what's called a Have Your Say campaign. And we asked people how they felt about the CBC and what changes that they wanted to see. And we got pretty close to 10,000 responses. And so that's what I'm referring to when I talk about how people feel about local news and its importance to them. So if you'll indulge me, I'll just read two to you. And the first is from Judy from Manitoba, who said, "Every morning, CBC local news connects me to my community like nothing else can. It's more than just reporting. It's a daily check-in on what's happening in our lives here. This service is crucial, especially in areas where other local media have disappeared. CBC's dedication to local stories not only informs us, it strengthens the bonds within our community." And I'll just read you one more, because again, I think it's always great for you to hear from the people. We may, speak for them and represent them, but these are their voices. This is Janet from Nova Scotia, who wrote, "CBC's local coverage is more than just news. It's the heartbeat of our town. But with each passing year, I worry we'll lose this vital connection. It's distressing to see local media dwindling. We can't let CBC follow that path. We need to ensure it remains a strong voice that can keep us united and informed about the nuances of our community." So I hope that answers your questions in terms of, if you mandate it, what will happen? Will people actually watch it? Because what we hear time and time again from our supporters is how much local news matters to them and how much they don't want to see it disappear.
But those are the people that are already still listening, and the people that we've lost, I don't know. I mean, I anecdotally will talk to people who are professionals and well-educated and in their 30s and 40s, and they say, like, we don't pay attention to that stuff anymore. We go on our device here, and I listen to this source, and I don't really care about the other. It would be more important to me to hear from the people that are not listening and whether they would be inclined to ever listen again.
Well, it's not. I think they are listening. They're just listening to other sources. So, but those other sources, like we have lots of new outlets that have emerged, they don't have the scope and reach, and they also don't have the regulatory responsibilities that someone like CBC has to provide rigorous journalism and news. A lot of it is opinion-based, and the reason why is because facts are expensive. And so local news is expensive to produce, which is why we see private media, pulling away from news, particularly local news, as they experience more and more financial difficulties. So I recognize that I can't speak for the silent, but the silent aren't necessarily, it's not necessarily that people aren't there, it's that they've been presented with other options. But I think we're underestimating how Canadians really feel about news and where they get their news. And we have this impression that everybody is getting their news from social media. But if you look at the polls and you look at the studies, that's actually not true. Social media is the least trusted form, or the least trusted platform where people go to get news. And like I already said, CBC is the most trusted. And so you have to look at the what's out there, where people are getting their sources from, and what the responsibilities are on those sources to actually provide, rigorous, verifiable, credible news versus, like I said, opinion. And I think more and more Canadians are getting fed up with the disinformation they're finding on social media, and they are looking for more and more trusted sources of news. And I do believe that Canadians feel they can get that trusted news from local news.
Madame Boltman, nous allons passer maintenant à la sénatrice Clément.
Thank you. We will now hear from Sénatrice Clément. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I was a city councillor and mayor back in the Jurassic Park days, where we actually had a reporter who covered the city council beat and sat through 4-6 hours of council meetings. And would report back to the community. And we were kind of irritated because, they would misquote us or there would be issues and we didn't agree. But at the end of the day, everybody in town sort of looked to that media in whatever format they got it. And we had legit community conversations, and people trusted what we were talking. They didn't always agree with us, but they certainly trusted that the council was doing things transparently and that it was being reported on by people that they know, that they see at the grocery store. A newspaper, yeah, absolutely. We still have newspaper, but now the journalist is covering 20 events per day and doesn't have time now because they've cut back on the staffing. So I want to ask you, any of you, so what is working? Like I think some of you have indicated that there are some news outlets that are making it. What are the commonalities that the ones that are sort of making it or still hanging in there? What do they have? I'd also like your comments on media that might be Indigenous-led or, identity, community-led, and whether those outlets are gaining some traction and whether they have built trust in, their information. Professor Lindgren.
Sure. Okay, well, there's a lot there. First, I would just say in terms of can trust be rebuilt, one of the, I think, key factors that we've seen in research is that having a reporter present on the ground in person, so you do run into them in the grocery store, for instance, is really key to building trusted local media. Because people have a sense that the reporters know the community, they know the issues. They're not parachuting in for 2 hours to do a story and then heading back out of town. So being present on the ground, I think, is really important, and something that CBC, Radio Canada reporters, we need to keep in mind that's an important part of what they do is being there and not just dropping by occasionally or once in a while. So that's the first thing. The second thing that is becoming increasingly evident about what helps local media survive is that content matters. So you can't. Advertising is really problematic these days. So people don't necessarily come to the local paper, radio station, or TV station for ads because, you can go online and there's ads and they're directed. You get directed exactly where you need to go for what you want to buy. So you're not coming for the ads, or you're not coming for the TV guide because that's not around much. You're not coming for the crossword puzzles. So why then go to local media? It's because that local media can provide content that is important for navigating everyday life. It could also be entertaining, could be fun, it could be sports, it could be just knowing what other people are doing, but it has to be news that matters to people. So being able to produce that kind of content is essential. The other thing is being engaged with the community. So it's increasingly evident that you can't news organizations can't be so transactional. Give us money, we'll drop a paper off at your door, or we'll give you access to our news site. Part of being a part of the community and producing and showing that you're engaged with the community is listening to what the community thinks is important. Trying to make sure that this coverage that you provide is reflective of the diversity in the community, and also that your newsroom is as well. The media is still falling far behind on that one, but still, it's also important. And so these are two things that are essential to the survival, because if you want people to pay, whether it's a subscription or make a donation or become a member because they believe in what you're doing, you have to give them something to believe in. So it's a very different model than, producing a publication that can live on, is getting rich on advertising, and you're the only game in town, and people are going to come to you because there's no really where else to go for news. And anyway, you can get all the grocery ads, and you can do the crossword puzzle and read the classifieds. That model doesn't exist anymore. So now it takes 3 or 4 different revenue streams to survive. And that requires an emphasis on content, being a part of the community, and doing journalism in the public interest that people are willing to pay for in some way, shape, or form.
On your question, do you want to hear somebody
anyone
quickly?
else on the indigenous-led or
and
race, language?
a bit shorter in terms of answers, so we can move on.
Hi, it's Marla.
Yes. Hi, Ms. Boltman.
Hi. I just wanted to. I thought April really summed that up quite well. So I don't want to top her, but I just want to add that I think the way local news will succeed is exactly what she said. It's because we don't have all these things anymore. Like it used to be when people opened the newspaper, they could look at the arts section, the lifestyle section, the metro section, the comics. They had all these other reasons to go to the newspaper, and Section A may have been part of it. But now what's happened with what's left of a lot of the mainstream media where we've lost the local news is all that's left is the A, the hard-hitting, polarizing news, for political junkies that often isn't relevant to the communities or their daily lives. And so that is why, as I mentioned before, we're seeing this reduction in people actually watching news or listening to news or reading news. They're tuning out and they're turning off because they don't like it. They don't like what they're hearing. So I think success will come if we can get back to this idea of this local news, where the trust is. Like we said, the person at the grocery store, these people, they're in your community. That is where we will win. We will bring people back to news, and we can sort of counter the polarization, counter the divisiveness, and for sure counter the disinformation.
I will ask a question specifically on CBC Radio-Canada, because we haven't quite focused on this during this panel, if you don't mind. I'd like to know briefly from both of you or all of you, is CBC Radio-Canada doing enough in local and regional news? What is your judgment on that? Are they present enough? Are they doing enough? Do they have enough money to be present in local news? Because we've talked about the whole context, and it's quite interesting. And you keep saying, Mrs. Lindgren, that's why CBC has to be there. But are they there? Is it enough? And, maybe to Marla, too. I would really like to have a concise answer from both of you.
Do you want us to go first? Since I forgot to unmute my microphone.
Go, please, Marla.
Okay.
Go.
Okay, so I'm actually going to hand it over to Sarah, and then.
Okay.
And now I will mute myself.
To answer your question very quickly, the CBC does provide vital local news to Canadians. Est-ce qu'ils peuvent en faire plus? Absolument.
Could they do more? Absolutely. As I was saying earlier, there should be a minimum amount to be spent on local services by the CBC Radio-Canada. We also know that in communities where the CBC Radio-Canada isn't present, more could be done. Is it a matter of funds? Perhaps. I think that a lot is expected of the CBC, whereas the funding is $33 per person per year only. Funding is really at the basis of their capacity. We'll see what the minister announces over the next few weeks to see what she proposes as a funding model. And we also expect her to speak to the importance of local news in a renewed and improved CBC Radio-Canada. And what do you think, Ms. Ingren?
The CBC could be doing more in terms of addressing the local, providing local news to communities. I think it could be more collaborative. In a community where there's one or two CBC reporters and, a small radio station, a small newspaper, I think there's the potential to work together to write, to do projects to try and address the problems that are confronting a community and seek solutions and create a forum for conversation. So I think it could do more. I think it could and should do more.
Okay, we have a few minutes left, Senator Simons, or... Yes. And did you have a really...
Well, I did want to come back to whether they have any data around indigenous-led news outlets or outlets that are providing news to specific communities. Are those... Do you keep track of those? Do you have any information on those? Do those work?
Well, I mean, CBC has quite a successful Indigenous service, a lot of programming. So I think that is important. I don't have any specific data on where they have bureaus in more isolated areas. I do know that a CBC station like Thunder Bay covers a huge area in the north with a lot of communities there. And so I grew up in that city, and the CBC now does cover those communities much better than it used to. But I mean, it's a question of priorities. I mean, what does CBC think is important? Another reporter on Parliament Hill, or more reporters in smaller communities that have lost local news outlets, or in the case of the north, or more isolated communities never had them?
Okay, so you think there should be less on Parliament Hill and more in the community? Because you did ask the question, but you did not answer the question, and we're here to hear some opinions.
Yeah, I would like to see, I don't necessarily want them to cut Parliament Hill. I would like to see more reporting at the local level, so more resources at the local level.
Okay, sorry, I didn't want to.
That's no problem.
Okay, so you have really 3 minutes.
I'm having an existential crisis after Senator Fridhandler's question, because I worked in local news. If I had a big front page scoop on the front page of the Edmonton Journal in 1999, I could be sure that 250,000 people would read it. But now, this whole study is predicated on the notion that we want the CBC to do more local coverage because we think local coverage is good. And in a world in which everybody is listening to Call Her Daddy and Joe Rogan and not the local news, how do we get people to stop being distracted by their access to all the news of the world, including the gong show going on south of the border, and to actually focus on the local news? I mean, maybe I'm trying to make people eat kale and oat bran, and they don't want kale and oat bran.
So it's a very easy question. So if you could tackle it very quickly, and we'll have to end soon. So please, really be brief.
Okay, it's Marla here. I'm going to say I like kale and oat bran for starters, and I think there's a lot of people out there who like kale and oat bran. But we keep saying that they're not there and they're not listening. But the McGill study that we just mentioned earlier talked about how 78% of Canadians want to see CBC continue to stick around and be funded. There are some criticisms, and that 78% number is predicated on fixing what ails them. And so I don't think it's the case of like these disappearing audiences, particularly for CBC News. I think CBC News is doing very well. I think a lot of the issues about audiences and numbers may relate more to entertainment programming, which is something that all television broadcasters are suffering from right now as we live in this age of foreign streamer American dominance. But in terms of people actually tuning into news, they are, and I think they'd like to be tuning into local news more if there was more available, and that's why people are particularly concerned about this crisis in local news that we're having.
Local news, that's the question.
Okay, so we may have to close this panel. Thank you very much. This was very interesting. Ms. Bolton, if you could send us this McGill study, I don't think we have it. It would really be interesting. Could you do that for us?
Sure, we can send that over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to all of you for your generosity. So we'll suspend briefly and go to the next panel. Thank you.